In October of 2021, a small group of weekend cavers made their way into the forgotten shafts of northern Arizona, places left behind since the days of gold fever and broken dreams. For them, this was a hobby, dirty, dangerous, but thrilling. That afternoon, however, their ropes and flashlights did not lead to rusted tools or veins of quartz. At the bottom of a narrow shaft, hidden by rock and brush for more than a decade, they found something that should never have been there. Two old sleeping bags, one blue and one green, sat pressed against the wall. At first, they looked like little more than abandoned camping gear. But stitched roughly shut with thick, uneven twine, they told a far darker story. The air was heavy with the unmistakable odor of decay. The cavers froze, realizing they were standing in the middle of something horrifying. When authorities finally opened the bags, the truth came into focus. Inside were the skeletal remains of Ray Larson and Nicole Edwards, a young couple who had vanished without a trace 11 years earlier. But their discovery did not close the case. Instead, it opened a deeper mystery, one that would reveal only more shadows, more uncertainty, and a haunting question that still lingers today. Who had done this, and why? Ray Larson and Nicole Edwards were not adventurers in the way people usually imagine. They weren't thrill-seekers chasing danger, nor were they drawn to the kind of high-risk wilderness challenges that fill news headlines. They were, in many ways, the picture of an ordinary young couple building a life together. Ray was 26, a graphic designer who spent most of his days in front of a computer in Phoenix. He had a quiet sense of humor, the kind that surfaced in small, unexpected moments. Nicole, 2 years younger, worked as a nurse. Friends described her as compassionate and steady, someone who had a calming effect on the people around her. Together, they made sense, two people in their mid-20s, comfortable in each other's company, looking ahead to the future while enjoying the small joys of the present. Their lifestyle was simple. They weren't drawn to expensive vacations or crowded resorts. What they enjoyed most was packing up the car, driving out of the city, and finding a quiet spot where the night sky stretched endlessly overhead. A tent, 2 sleeping bags, a small stove, and the sound of crickets in the dark that was enough for them. They valued the kind of weekends that many people overlook. No phone service, no deadlines, no obligations, just a chance to sit by a fire and watch the stars. In June of 2010, they planned another one of these short escapes. It was not unusual, and no one around them thought anything of it. The plan was straightforward. Leave Phoenix on a Friday morning, drive north, and spend a few days exploring parts of northern Arizona. They intended to visit the Grand Canyon, one of the most iconic landscapes in the country, before making their way back with a few stops along the way. This wasn't a cross-country trek or some daring wilderness expedition. It was simply a romantic weekend getaway, the kind of trip countless couples take every year. They packed carefully, making sure they had what they needed. The tent was folded and tucked neatly in the back seat, along with 2 sleeping bags and a pair of backpacks filled with clothes. They had food, water, and a camping stove for simple meals. A paper map rested alongside a digital camera. Nicole loved to capture their trips in photos, even when nothing dramatic was happening. These were ordinary preparations, the sort of checklist any careful traveler would make. Their silver Toyota Corolla, recently serviced and in good condition, was ready for the drive. Nothing about their departure suggested trouble. Friends remembered them as cheerful, looking forward to a small break from the routines of work and city life. There were no ominous remarks, no second thoughts, no sense that this trip might be their last. That Friday morning, as they pulled out of Phoenix, they were just another young couple on the road, following a familiar route toward one of America's natural wonders. They could not have known that this journey, meant to be a peaceful escape, would instead become the beginning of a mystery that still defies explanation more than a decade later. On Saturday, the 12th of June, 2010, Ray and Nicole made what would become their final confirmed stop. They pulled into a small gas station near the southern entrance to the Grand Canyon National Park. It was an unremarkable place, the kind of roadside stop countless travelers pass through every summer. Surveillance cameras showed them arriving in their silver Toyota Corolla, Ray at the wheel and Nicole in the passenger seat with a folded paper map in her lap. Inside, they bought nothing unusual, just a tank of gas, a bottle of water, and a bag of chips to share on the road. The cashier on duty later recalled them as a perfectly ordinary young couple. They seemed calm, even cheerful, not hurried or nervous. Nicole leaned on the counter with an easy smile, while Ray swiped his card for the purchase. There was no sense of being watched, no other car lingering in the background, no stranger hovering nearby. It was the kind of transaction a clerk might forget 5 minutes later, except that it would turn out to be the last time anyone would see Ray and Nicole alive. From that moment on, the trail went cold. They drove south on Highway 180, and then nothing. No more credit card activity, no cell phone calls or messages. Nicole, who had a ritual of calling her mother after every trip, failed to check in on Sunday evening. At first, her mother brushed it off, assuming the couple was still on the road or caught in an area with poor cell service. That had happened before. But when Monday morning came and neither Ray nor Nicole showed up for work, the casual worry sharpened into alarm. Calls to their phones went straight to voicemail. Neither workplace had received any word. No messages about being delayed or needing a day off. Their absence was completely out of character. Friends, coworkers, and family began to sense that something was terribly wrong. By Monday evening, their names were on official missing persons reports. What made the situation so unsettling was how quickly their normal, predictable life seemed to unravel. One day, they were buying snacks and gas like every other traveler on that summer highway. The next, they had vanished into silence. For investigators, that gas station became a haunting marker, the last window into Ray and Nicole's lives, before they disappeared without explanation. When Ray and Nicole failed to return to Phoenix, the first hours were filled with hopeful explanations. Maybe they had car trouble. Maybe they had chosen to take a scenic route and lost cell service. But by Monday evening, those hopes had given way to fear. Their families filed official reports, and the police launched a missing persons investigation. The first step was to track their cell phones. What investigators found was unsettling. Both phones had gone dark on Saturday, the very day the couple was last seen at the gas station. The final signal, or ping, came from an area not far from that stop, just miles away from where they had fueled up and bought their snacks. After that, silence. Neither phone ever connected to a tower again. Bank records told the same story. Aside from the small purchase at the gas station, there was no further activity on their cards. No hotel stays, no grocery stops, no late-night ATM withdrawals. It was as though Ray and Nicole had simply stopped existing in the digital world. In modern investigations, that kind of vanishing act is rare. People almost always leave a trail: calls, texts, transactions. But in this case, there was nothing. Search teams were quickly organized. Volunteers, park rangers, and police combed the forests and canyons along Highway 180. Helicopters circled overhead, sweeping the ground below for any sign of a vehicle, a campfire, or even scraps of fabric. Sniffer dogs were brought in, trained to follow human scent across miles of rough terrain. For days, the search expanded outward in every direction. Northern Arizona, however, is vast and unforgiving. Thick forests give way to rocky desert stretches. Canyons carve the land into mazes where visibility is limited and sound travels strangely. Even with dozens of people working in shifts, covering every path and trail they could find, the landscape swallowed any trace of the couple. As the days passed, the lack of progress was crushing. Not a footprint, not a tire track, not a single item belonging to Ray or Nicole surfaced. Search leaders admitted quietly to the families that finding two people in that wilderness was like trying to locate a needle in a haystack. After nearly a week of effort, the official search was scaled back. The silence left behind was almost more unsettling than if they had found wreckage or evidence of harm. It was as if Ray and Nicole had stepped off the edge of the map and been erased. For their families, that absence marked the beginning of a long nightmare, one that would stretch on for years without answers. It was nearly 2 weeks after Ray and Nicole first disappeared, when searchers stumbled onto a clue that should have blown the mystery wide open. Deep along an isolated Forest Service road, miles from any main highway, their silver Toyota Corolla was found. The car was parked neatly off to the side, not wrecked or hidden, just sitting as though it had been left there intentionally. Dust had begun to settle on the windshield, but otherwise, it looked strangely untouched. When investigators opened the doors, what they found was unsettling in its normalcy. Inside the car, almost everything the couple had taken on their trip remained. Their tent was still folded in the trunk, along with extra clothes, a small cooler, and Nicole's nursing bag. Both of their wallets, complete with IDs and credit cards, were inside the glove compartment. Even their travel documents and Ray's camera were accounted for. Nothing had been stolen, nothing had been scattered. But a few details stood out. Small things that made the scene feel off-kilter. The car keys were not in the ignition, but lying in plain sight on the driver's seat. On the dashboard, an open bag of chips sat half-eaten, as if someone had stepped out for just a moment and never returned. And perhaps most curious of all, a folded paper map was spread open on the passenger seat, showing the network of Forest Service roads around the Grand Canyon. These details raised more questions than answers. If Ray and Nicole had chosen to walk away from the car, why leave behind their wallets and essentials? If they had been forced to leave, why was there no sign of struggle? Everything about the vehicle suggested a sudden pause, a moment interrupted, with no explanation for what came after. For the families, the discovery of the car was both a relief and a torment. It proved that Ray and Nicole had made it farther than the gas station, and that they hadn't simply vanished into thin air. But the intact belongings painted a picture of two people who had every reason to return and never did. Investigators were left grappling with the most haunting question of all. What could have compelled a young couple to leave everything behind in the middle of the forest and disappear without a trace? For the next 11 years, Ray and Nicole's disappearance sat in the uneasy space between tragedy and riddle. The case remained officially open, but without leads, it grew cold. In that vacuum, theories sprouted like weeds. On internet forums, late-night radio shows, and small true crime blogs that dissected every scrap of detail. One popular idea was the specter of a highway serial killer. At the time, the Southwest had seen its share of predators who targeted travelers on lonely stretches of road. Could Ray and Nicole have crossed paths with someone like that? Others speculated about a drug lab hidden somewhere in the remote desert forests. Arizona had long been a corridor for trafficking, and the theory suggested they may have stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see. Another, more haunting rumor spoke of a hermit living deep in the wilderness, a recluse who might have seen the young couple as intruders. None of these theories carried real evidence, but in the absence of answers, they gained traction, shaping the way strangers thought about the case. Meanwhile, their families refused to let the story fade. Nicole's mother gave countless media interviews, often holding up photographs of her daughter, with a quiet determination that carried both grief and grit. Ray's younger brother poured hours into maintaining a website dedicated to tips and possible sightings, a digital bulletin board where strangers could send in notes, however far-fetched. Both families pooled money to hire private investigators when official channels dried up. Leads came and went, some pointing to distant truck stops, others to reported sightings in Mexico, but none held water. The years dragged on with a cruel rhythm. Anniversaries were marked not by celebration but by vigils. Holidays passed with empty seats at the table. Each phone call brought a flash of hope that usually ended in disappointment. And through it all, the car remained the most tangible clue, a silent reminder that Ray and Nicole had been real, that they had been planning for the next step of their lives before vanishing into a void. By 2021, the case had become what many detectives privately admit they dread. A cold file with no momentum, yet impossible to close because families still clung to the possibility of answers. For those who loved Ray and Nicole, the silence was its own kind of torture. And the question that haunted them was not just how the couple disappeared, but why the world seemed incapable of finding them. It was the fall of 2021, when a group of amateur cavers decided to explore an abandoned mine shaft on the outskirts of northern Arizona. The entrance was narrow, half hidden by brush and debris, the kind of place you would never notice unless you were searching for it. For them, it was supposed to be just another weekend adventure, one of those adrenaline-filled trips where the reward was simply being the first to see what had been forgotten underground. They carried their ropes and lights, laughing as they made their descent, unaware that what lay waiting would forever change the story of two missing people. Deep inside the shaft, tucked against the rocky wall, they noticed two old sleeping bags. At first glance, they seemed like discarded gear from long-ago campers. But something was off. The fabric was bulging in unnatural ways, the seams crudely stitched shut with thick twine. The cavers froze. A chill settled over the group as realization crept in. These weren't sleeping bags abandoned by chance. They were containers. They were hiding something. The sheriff's office was called, and within hours the mine had transformed from an adventure site into a sealed crime scene. Forensic teams moved carefully, documenting every detail before extracting the bags from the darkness. When the zippers were finally opened, the grim truth emerged. Inside were skeletal remains, fragile and weathered by years underground. Through dental records and DNA testing, the remains were identified as Ray Larson and Nicole Edwards. After 11 years of silence, of unanswered questions and countless theories, the couple who had once set out for a simple road trip to the Grand Canyon had finally been found. But discovery did not bring closure. Instead, it raised an even more haunting mystery. How had their journey led them here, into a hidden shaft far from their intended path? Who had placed them in those bags, sewn shut with such deliberate care? And why, after more than a decade, did the truth still feel so far out of reach? The answers, it seemed, had been buried with them. And the cave's discovery was less an ending than the beginning of yet another chapter in a story filled with shadows. The autopsy results brought a grim clarity to the mystery, though with it came an even deeper unease. For years, speculation had swirled. Had Ray and Nicole gotten lost, suffered an accident, or been victims of something darker? Now, the medical examiner's findings erased any hope of a benign explanation. Ray Larson's remains told a story of violence. His skull bore the distinct fractures of blunt force trauma, the kind inflicted by a heavy object wielded with intent. There was no ambiguity. This had been an attack, swift and fatal. Nicole Edwards' cause of death was different, but no less chilling. Evidence around her neck revealed marks consistent with strangulation. Forensic experts were certain she had been killed by human hands. What made the discoveries even more unsettling was not only how they died, but where they had been before their bodies were sealed inside those sleeping bags. Analysis of decomposition, insect activity, and soil traces suggested that both Ray and Nicole had been kept somewhere else, likely indoors, for at least 24 to 48 hours before being dumped in the abandoned mine. This was no spur-of-the-moment crime. It required planning, a hidden space, and the confidence to hold two bodies without fear of discovery. For investigators, that detail changed everything. Whoever had killed Ray and Nicole wasn't simply an opportunist or a passerby. The killer had access to a secure location, perhaps a shed, a basement, or an isolated cabin, somewhere private enough to delay disposal. That implied familiarity with the area and a degree of control that pointed toward someone local, or at least someone who knew the terrain well. To the families, the revelations were a devastating confirmation of what they had long feared but could never prove. Ray and Nicole hadn't simply vanished into the wilderness. They had been hunted, killed, and hidden. The violence was intimate, deliberate, and personal. And yet, for all the clarity the autopsy provided, it also deepened the central question: who would go to such lengths to silence two ordinary young people on a weekend trip? The answers, if they existed, still lay buried in silence. The mine had given up its secret, but the killers— When the bodies of Ray Larson and Nicole Edwards were finally recovered in October 2021, investigators faced the daunting task of reopening a case that had grown cold for more than a decade. Evidence, once fresh, had now endured 11 years of decay, weather, and neglect. Still, detectives combed through every detail with the hope that modern science and renewed attention might yield answers that had once seemed impossible. The crime scene itself, an abandoned mine shaft deep in the Arizona wilderness, offered both a revelation and a challenge. The two sleeping bags had been crudely sewn shut with coarse thread, the kind found in any hardware store. Forensic experts noted there were no unique fibers, no unusual stitching patterns, and no retail markers that might trace the material back to a single source. Time had stripped away almost everything identifiable. The fabric was sun-bleached and brittle, carrying little more than the weight of what it had concealed. DNA testing, once considered the golden key to solving unsolved crimes, offered limited help here. After years in such harsh conditions, the genetic material was badly degraded. While technicians were able to extract partial profiles, none of the sequences were strong enough to match to known suspects or national databases. The silence of the evidence was almost as chilling as the crime itself. What investigators could build, however, was a psychological and behavioral profile of the killer. This was not the work of someone impulsive. The methodical way the bodies were hidden, kept elsewhere for days, then transported and deliberately concealed in sewn bags, pointed to an organized, calculating individual. The person had to be physically strong to carry out the act, and disciplined enough to avoid leaving obvious traces. The setting also raised an important clue. Whoever committed the murders knew the mine existed, knew it was remote, and felt confident it would remain undisturbed for years. That suggested someone with a strong familiarity with the local landscape, possibly a hunter, a prospector, or even a longtime resident of the area, who understood its forgotten corners better than most. To law enforcement, the message was clear. Ray and Nicole's deaths were not random. They were the victims of someone deliberate, someone practiced in concealment, and someone who likely walked among the community all these years without suspicion. The renewed investigation brought fresh eyes, sharper tools, and the haunting awareness that the killer may still be out there silent, watching, and perhaps even emboldened by the fact that, for more than a decade, he had gotten away with murder. In the end, what remains is a story without resolution, a tragedy that has left the family with more questions than answers. After 11 years of searching, Ray and Nicole were finally brought home, but only as remains sealed in evidence bags. Their loved ones, who once held out hope of a miraculous return, were forced to settle for the bare minimum of closure, knowing where the couple had been all along, hidden in darkness. But closure without justice is no real comfort. The truth is brutal. Someone chose to end their lives, and that someone has never been named, never been caught, and may still be living quietly in plain sight. That is perhaps the most chilling part of this story. The person responsible was organized, calculating, and patient enough to hide two lives from the world for over a decade. If they could do that once, What's to say they didn't do it before or won't do it again? It is a reminder that even in places that feel familiar, safe, and ordinary, danger can linger just beneath the surface. The Arizona desert, vast and unyielding, continues to hold its secrets, keeping its silence, while families are left with grief. As we close this chapter, we must remember that stories like this are not just about the past, they are warnings about the present. The killer may still be out there, hidden among everyday people, carrying on as if nothing ever happened. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more true accounts of mystery, disappearance, and the search for truth, make sure to subscribe to Mystery Unknown Files. Together, we will continue to explore the shadows, ask the hard questions, and shine a light on the stories the world tries to forget.